Hello everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I have for you my last Christmas card in this year series. Well, last card with a voiceover. I still have one card for YouTube Shorts. This card is quick and simple. It was actually supposed to be a YouTube short or Instagram reel, one of those vertical videos, but I really like it, so I decided to make a proper video with a voiceover. Plus, I managed to make a mistake and I learned something. I'm going to be creating a simple green distress ink background, and the main colors are forest moss and peeled paint, but I'm also going to be using chipped sapphire and bundled sage. And then I'm going to use a stencil to do a tone-on-tone blending, as well as use it with embossing paste and embossing powder. If you would like to see the full product list, just hop over to my website. The link is in the description below. I'm making a long or slimline card, but you can make the typical card in the size A6 or if you're in the US A2. The cardstock I'm using is the Canson XL. I like to use it for ink blending, but the cardstock is not bright white, so I needed to apply a few layers of the ink. If you are using white cardstock for the blending, you might need only 1 or 2 layers of the ink. I began applying a sort of a base layer. I started with the darkest green, the forest moss, and I applied it around the edges of the panel. I wanted the middle of the panel to be lighter, so I applied the colors, creating sort of an oval shape. Then I took the ink peeled paint and I applied the ink along the forest moss, blending the colors together. Before I applied the second layer, I took the stencil. Here I'm going to do the tone-on-tone blending. I placed the stencil at the bottom corner of the panel. I secured it with a tape. This is the Post-it tape. And then I started working on the next layer of colors. Again, I'm working from outside to in, but I'm only applying the inks inside of the stencil. And here I started with the dark blue, the chipped sapphire. For my trial card, I only used the 3 green shades, but then I watched a video on Christina Werner's channel, and she added blue on the outer edges to make it darker, so I thought I will give it a try. You can skip this if you don't have this color. Then I used the forest green and peeled paint. The bundled sage, the lightest color I will be using at the end, is just for the blending of the middle part. I removed the stencil and placed it on the other end of the panel, and I repeated the process. You can see that the stencil created a very nice tone-on-tone look. You can leave it as it is and add a sentiment, but I wanted the stencil pattern to blend a little bit more, looking a little bit more faded. So I applied another layer of the inks and I went over the pattern. I repeated the same process. I started with the blue and then the darkest green, middle green, and I finished with the lightest green. I finished up the blending, and next was the time to use the stencil with the embossing paste and embossing powder. Again, I secured the stencil with the Post-it tape, and then I applied the embossing paste over the stencil using a palette knife. This embossing paste is from Old and New. Once I was happy with the application, I removed the stencil. Do not forget to wash the stencil before the paste dries. Luckily, the embossing paste from Old and New doesn't dry too quickly, so I had some time to clean it. Next, I sprinkled the embossing powder over it, and here I made a mistake. I did not let the ink background fully dry. If you are using only the embossing paste without embossing powder, that's fine. But if you are using it together with the embossing powder, the background has to be fully dry. Here you can see the powder was sticking everywhere. I was trying to clean it up with my brush, but it was not working. But instead of tossing it to the bin and redoing everything, I decided to let the embossing paste dry. I came back in the morning, the paste was dry and so was the ink on the panel, and I was able to remove the powder that was sticking in the little gaps using my brush, and nothing removed from the actual pattern. Next, I took my heat gun and I melted the powder. I really love the process melting the powder. One of the reasons why I really like to use the embossing paste and embossing powder together is because I love the process of melting the powder when using the embossing paste with the embossing powder. It just really looks cool. And I was really happy that I was able to save it. It would be really pity if I had to throw it away. Next, I used the stencil again. I placed it on the opposite end of the panel, which will be the top of the card. I applied the embossing paste over it, just like I did on the bottom pad. And since the ink was fully dry, plus I also used an anti-static powder, just to make sure that the embossing powder doesn't stick everywhere, I was able to melt the powder right away without waiting for the paste to dry. I don't know which method is the correct one. For me, it's much more exciting to watch the powder melt when I melt it right away, because as the powder melts, it sort of starts bubbling and it's fun to watch. And this is the method I use all the time. However, the end results are different. When you wait for the texture paste with the embossing powder to dry before melting it, the texture of the embossing is much more smoother, as you can see here. But when you melt it right away, the texture is more, I don't know, it's not really rough, but it's more like uneven. Because when you start melting it, it creates these bubbles and it doesn't smooth out. This is something I did not know, so thanks to me making a mistake, I learned something. Before adhering the panel onto the card base, I worked on the greeting. I would have loved to use a die cut sentiment. I think that would look the best. But I still don't have my die cutting machine with me, so I could not do that, and stamping was my only option. I thought I'm going to stamp directly onto the card base and heat emboss, but the sentiment was hardly visible. I did like it, but then I fished out this stamp set with a banner, and I thought that was a better choice. I picked a banner that says Merry Christmas. I don't know about you, but since I'm not a native English speaker, I really don't like the greeting Happy Holidays, because that would be my other option. The word holidays to me represents a time of work, not Christmas time. What about you? What kind of sentiments do you prefer for your Christmas cards? Let me know in the comments. As you see, I stamped the sentiment and heat embossed it with an embossing powder, and then I cut it with my scissors. The embossing powder is the metallic brass from WOW, and I used it for all the heat embossing. I adhered the panel on top of a card base. I bought these long card bases already pre-made with envelopes. And on top of it, in the middle, I adhered the banner, for which I used a double-sided foam tape, so it's a little bit raised. And the card is done! As I said, I really love using a stencil with an embossing paste and embossing powder for Christmas cards. It makes it really special with hardly any effort. Well, if you don't mess it up, of course. Since this is my last Christmas card where I talk, I want to wish you all a very Merry Christmas. I hope you will have the opportunity to spend it the way you like it. And to all of you who have to work during Christmas, I hope you still manage to have an enjoyable time as much as possible. Thank you all so much for watching. I will be taking about 2 weeks off. That means I will see you next year.